The Paris Peace Forum was built in 2018 with the idea that global collaboration can be reinvented from the bottom up, and that impactful solutions already exist out there. And unfortunately, some of those solutions fall short in achieving their objective and having a systemic change in global governance. And that's where the Scale Up program comes in.
Every year, we have a call for solutions from which 60 projects are showcased at our annual event at the Paris Peace Forum. Out of those projects, we have 10 projects that are selected by a jury to benefit from the year of scale-up support. We try to help them determine the objectives that they want to change within that 1 year with the mentors.
Le rôle d'un mentor est celui de, disons, aider à rester concentré, de dire la vérité, de créer et de faciliter des connexions, des relations, et de donner des conseils.
Often the hardest part is to not just get in the room, but to know how to, who to talk to and what things and issues matter to the people you're engaging with. So our mentors were really helpful across all those things.
What was more rewarding is to see that we were able to take the SCUP project from point A to point B, supporting the growth of the project, identifying the blind spots, and helping the project leaders to make significant progress over the course of 1 year.
The Scale program has 3 pillars. So firstly, we have the mentorship, where each project is paired up with 2 high-level experts, the capacity building workshops every month, and a support from the Paris Peace Forum Secretariat.
The types of projects are very diverse and they come from all over the world.
The first day that the war in Ukraine started, we put all our regular activity on hold and we started building the digital infrastructure that was needed by the refugees coming into Romania.
Josia est un programme pour sauvegarder le patrimoine en situation d'urgence. Faire partie du Scale-up programme nous a permis de réaliser à quel point nous agissons pour la paix.
Empatia is a project that promotes the use of AI to solve public issues such as health, development, or climate change.
The purpose of the initiative is to create collaboration on environmental issues across the India-Pakistan border on issues like air pollution, water usage, and sustainable agriculture.
The Scale-up program is an accelerator of global governance solutions. We aim to help project teams be better equipped to influence and challenge governance, and ultimately help them amplify their impact and their reach.
Being recognised for the work we were trying to do to make change globally out of Africa and out of the global south was part of what the Scale Up Award meant for us.
We've had a phenomenal year throughout the SCUP program, and I think the secret to kind of growing and scaling impact is collaboration.
To both project leaders and to experts, we ask them, please join us and get involved with the Scale program.
Bonjour, bonjour, et merci.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear the interpreting?
Très, très bienvenue aujourd'hui.
A very warm welcome to all of you to this session. Now, we are here today to discuss taxation. And if you don't mind, I'll be speaking English for the rest of the session.
So we're here today to talk about taxation in particular for people and the planet, and in particular how small taxes on the super rich can help solve big global challenges. And I think for me personally, I've been reporting on financial affairs for The Guardian for 30 years now. My name is Juliet Garside, by the way. And this question about taxing the super rich, taxing the billionaires has never felt so urgent. During COVID, the world's 5 richest men increased their fortunes, doubled them in many cases. And they also happened to pay an effective tax rate near zero in many cases as well. But in the meantime, the costs of the pandemic were paid for by workers through cuts to benefits, through a massive increase in taxation of wages, and all this at a time of high inflation. So taxes on the super rich are not just about equality, and I'd like also for us to talk today about the carbon footprint. The carbon footprint of the wealthiest 1% is, according to some measures, the same as the carbon footprint of the least wealthy 66% in the world. So how do we deal with that? I think many people feel the time has come to properly tax excess wealth. But how? Well, luckily, I have with me today 4 people who have put a lot of thought into this issue, and I hope we'll have some excellent answers or beginnings of answers for us, some next steps here today. So without further ado, let me introduce, first of all, Quentin Parinello, who is from he's a policy director at the EU Tax Observatory. It's a think tank here in Paris, set up by the economist Gabriel Zucman, who's done a great deal to explore offshore tax evasion and avoidance, and now is working on this really important project on how to tax the world's billionaires. It's an idea that the G20 is now committed to pushing forward, and I think their ideas will give us all a lot to think about and a lot of hope. Next to Quentin is Frédérique Roder, and she's VP for Global Advocacy and Policy at Global Citizen. It's a fantastic charity that mobilizes young people to combat poverty and climate change. And she's going to talk about green solidarity taxes, and in particular something called the Bridgetown Initiative. And then I'm very happy to say we have William Roos here from the Direction Générale du Trésor in the French Economics Ministry. And he also happens to be co-president of the G20 Working Group on Global Finance and Architecture. Last but not least, Pedro Abomave, all the way from Brazil. He is VP of Programs at the Open Society Foundation, which is heavily invested in journalism, including helping fund some of my own newspaper, The Guardian's climate reporting, but also heavily invested in promoting economic justice. We've got about 40 minutes, so I hope we will have time for questions from the audience at the end. I'll try and make time, but if the speakers could stick to 3 to 5 minutes for your answers, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. So Quentin, let me start with you. The EU Tax Observatory has been at the forefront of this idea of a global tax on billionaires. Can you tell us how this proposal would work? How could such a thing work? You know, 100 plus countries agreeing on tax, and what the next steps are for you.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here with you. As you said, this idea has been in the public debate for a while now. There's a long history of campaigning on increased taxation of the super rich. So what is essentially new in that conversation? I would say 3 important things. First of all, the leadership of the Brazilian G20 that basically put the taxation of the super rich as one of its priorities this year and normalized the conversation at an institutional level. This idea for a while has been seen as a utopian idea, and we're gradually starting to have institutional conversation on increased taxation of the super rich. Second, we have new data, new official tax data, showing in an increasing number of countries that the super rich pay less taxes than the rest of the population. And third, of course, as Juliette laid out very eloquently already, we're in a post-COVID context, and we're asking who will foot the bill of COVID. And there's a very strong political question here. Should we make middle class pay for the COVID bill, or should we make the very rich pay for the COVID bill? And this is with that agenda that Brazil invited Gabriel Zucman back in February in Sao Paulo to make the case for a global agenda on the taxation of the super rich to G20 finance ministers. It's been 25 years that the G20 talks about international taxation, but not a single time there was a conversation on the taxation of the super rich. there was a strong reception by G20 finance ministers on the need to safeguard progressivity and a call for more details from Gabriel Zuckman. So our boss was commissioned a report by the Brazilian G20 presidency to lay out what an agenda on taxing the rich would look like. And the idea is essentially very similar to what we've seen on multinational corporations. Taxation is a sovereign rights of states. Taxing corporations, taxing individuals is a sovereign right of states, but an additional layer, an international layer that strengthens tax cooperation, that strengthens the fight against aggressive tax avoidance, actually helps deliver effective taxation for the super rich. So the report commission explained how technically we could design a minimum tax on the super rich. Very similarly in philosophy to what was designed for corporations. The idea was to target very wealthy individuals and make sure that they pay a minimum in income tax. That minimum in our scenario was expressed as a fraction of wealth. It's not exactly a wealth tax, it's more as a top-up of income tax. And the report explains how building on previous steps of international corporations, we can make that proposal feasible. I don't have a lot of time to explain the details, so let me just skip to this. The report was released in June, so 5 months after the first conversation. And in July, all G20 countries agreed on the need to work on this issue, so they recognized that there's a need for international cooperation on this issue and committed to work cooperatively on this. Now, a minimum tax on billionaires or on the super rich is the last mile of the conversation. What we need now is a global agenda that features improvements on transparency, on cooperation, on fighting harmful tax practices, and on establishing that minimum level of taxation for the super rich. And this agenda is all the more necessary now, and this is what we're working on, both at the G20 and 9 additional number of fora, and I'll come back to that later. Thank you very much, Juliette.
Great. Thank you, Quentin. Frédéric, Global Citizen has been very supportive of the other leg of this conversation, which is green levies. And there are a few different ideas out there. There's the Bridgetown Initiative, which is supportive of an idea of green solidarity levies. Would you talk us through what these are and where we are in the conversation, how likely they are to actually happen on a multilateral level?
Thanks a lot, Juliette, and it's great to be here. It's great to be able to discuss these issues here, and I think this already shows how much the debate has evolved. It's really at the core of discussing the SDGs, how we actually are able to make progress on climate change and so on, and very timely because COP29 obviously opens today as well. So Global Citizen is not a taxation organization at all. However, over the last few years, and I think COVID, but also the climate emergency obviously accelerated this thinking on our side, but actually with a lot of actors. It's just the realization that first, we need to significantly scale financing if we want to keep on track on obviously eradicating extreme poverty, but also helping the poorest and most vulnerable countries in actually countering the climate crisis. And this money won't fall from the sky. We need to look into the options that exist and that we can actually, where we can make progress in the next few years and not just in 20 years' time. The other realization was, is that we're in a situation now where since a year's time, the global community agreed to move away from fossil fuels. At the same time, we see that the biggest polluters actually are either not taxed at all or totally undertaxed, which is just not a way forward. A very good example is obviously kerosene, air transport. There's even a global agreement that this goes untaxed, which is obviously, I mean, it's a global agreement that stems from just after the World War II, which just doesn't make sense in 2024. So based on this, there have been many more discussions on different types of taxation, including on the ultra-rich, and this is very good. Different options are on the table. And I think what's important here to note, especially also after last week's election, is that some of them are conversations that will take a long time, but actually don't have to take that long. And also, most importantly, they don't require consensus at G20 level or even UN level. It's actually enough if you have a number of countries getting together who want to make progress, or even a single country actually could make progress. And I think the best example we actually have is France, and we do hope that we can still point to France once the current budget bill has been adopted, because France actually since 2006 has one tax, and then in 2012 they added a second one, 2 taxes that we can call solidarity levies. So you ask me, what are the options on the table? There are actually quite a few. I think the most interesting ones are those that can be implemented quite quickly and can bring in a lot of money, and ideally, obviously, weigh on those that pollute most. So what we call internalizing externalities from an economic perspective. So one is definitely air traffic. Among the most polluting sectors, kerosene goes untaxed. There are already attempts at this. There are ways of actually changing this globally or regionally or bilaterally, but there are ways of doing this. An easier way might be actually just to put on a levy on airplane tickets, as France and a number of other countries did, and actually Brazil and President Lula back then also supported heavily. So one is air traffic. Then I would add, obviously, the tax on the ultra-rich, but Quentin already spoke about this. And I think what would be interesting here to see is that while we're not yet at the last mile, it can actually go much quicker than we thought. I mean, we saw this with a minimum tax on corporates, and also that we don't necessarily have to have all the heavyweights around the table. Very important in the light of the US elections. Then something that's been obviously very discussed, and I think makes total sense also based on the COP28 agreement, is taxing fossil fuel production. Ideally, obviously, it would be something binding, not just a voluntary contribution. We've seen many countries actually putting in place windfall profit taxes, so we have examples we can build on. And I would add, which is maybe not that straightforward, but it makes a lot of sense if you want to actually mobilize a lot of money, is the financial transaction tax. You have a number of countries who have one. It's a very tested tax. It doesn't weigh on let's say, John Doe, because most of the people don't have shares, or at least don't trade them every day. It's a very small tax rate that can bring in, I mean, at G20 level, 250 billion. I'm saying this also because I think if people are looking at for instance, the articles coming out now for COP29, which has been labeled the finance COP, the financing needs are just huge. And it might give the impression that the financing needs are so huge that we will never be able to actually fund them anyways. And that's not true. The reality is, and we've actually put out a report which is called Where's the Money? If you put a few options together, and in reality this is what needs to be done, it's not just the tax on the ultra-rich, it's not just maritime transport or financial transactions, you need to put everything together. We can have this step change in terms of financing, and especially non-debt financing. And that's very important to address climate adaptation, loss and damage, and to help really the poorest among the poorest.
Well, thank you for giving some really concrete examples there. I think it really helps. And just to repeat, the billionaires tax, one of the proposals there is that it would be, there are 3,000 billionaires, I think, in the world, aren't there? So it would be to set the rate at, for example, 2%. I mention that because William, in France, in the National Assembly last month, obviously France, like many countries, is facing huge deficits post-COVID, some of the biggest since the Second World War, and needs to raise taxes, as we have done in my country, in the UK, in one of the biggest tax-raising budgets since the war. And one of the proposals put forward, at least at this point, has been for a 2% wealth tax on anyone with assets over 1 billion euros in France. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that proposal will survive the budget negotiations, and also to talk to us a bit about whether we can be looking forward to not just filling the deficit, but dealing with climate through taxation at such a difficult time.
Merci beaucoup. Vous m'entendez? Oui.
Je vous entends parfaitement.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to share the priorities of France within the European framework and the framework of the G20. So a first element of this new taxation is that of fiscal justice, equity. And that's even more true when we need to do efforts, as we currently must in France, to lower public deficit. We need to do efforts in terms of spending, but also in terms of fiscal income. So this idea of justice is a very important stake. So the idea of where discussions are going to go inside the French Parliament, well, we'll have to see. But starting February this year, the finance minister at the time, Bruno Le Maire, had started talking to his counterpart, his Brazilian counterpart, Mr. Haddad, to further this agenda of fairness in taxation of the richest citizens, because we needed to foster consent to taxation, because the burden needs to be shared by all. And it's like the big companies. If we do things only separately, country by country, there's a risk of tax flight, tax evasion. And rich people have a greater ability than poorer people, just like bigger companies, to move their assets between countries. So France was very happy for this Brazilian initiative, this declaration about taxation. It's the first time we have such a consensus in G20, and it's an example of multilateral cooperation. We need to work in terms of transparency. We need to exchange information to guarantee efficiency in tax collection. We need to talk about damaging practices and eliminating these. And as we did with the taxation agenda for the biggest companies, we need to move towards a minimum tax rate. So we have this agenda, which is strongly supported by France. At the same time, there's another agenda, which is to be looking for new sources of funding. We know that we need to optimize the money we are currently spending. We have to improve the impact of multilateral development banks. We have to mobilize private finance. We have to recapitalize development banks, but we also need new sources of funding. And so, in the vein of the dynamic created by the summit in Paris in 2023 for a new financial pact, a new coalition was created under the scope of 4P. So it's global solidarity, international contributions. This coalition is co-chaired by Kenya, Barbados, and France, and it gathers the agenda of Nairobi, of the Paris Pact, and of Bridgestone. So it's really an example, one of the examples of this type of coalition, with members that support us. So it's a group of experts that are looking at the different options and are trying to develop impact measurements. And then there's going to be a more classic approach with fiscal negotiation. And to conclude, I will say that the feeling we have is that on this type of agenda for taxation, we need political momentum. We need our finance ministers and even our leaders, our heads of state, to steer things, give a direction for the experts, and also because there's going to be a next step, which is that once we've decided together that there's a certain taxation basis, what do we do afterwards? How do we steer these amounts? These are difficult topics because we're talking about sovereignty. So how do we accept that a part of the taxes that we raise are dedicated to solidarity goals so that we can define our objectives together.
Support is very, very important. It is a very challenging thing in the context of what we're discussing today, because we're talking about taxes on some of the wealthiest companies with the biggest budgets for lobbying governments, and we're talking about taxes on people, like Elon Musk or Bernard Arnault here in France, who have a great deal of money to influence the media, to own the media, to fund political campaigns. So, Pedro, I was going to ask you, with Open Society Foundations, you've invested heavily in more just economic systems, in promoting these. But interestingly, of course, you are yourselves funded by a billionaire, George Soros. So doesn't he stand to lose? Don't billionaires like him stand to lose as a result of these proposals?
No, I think, first of all, billionaires that are concerned about the future of the world stand much more to win in a process like that than to lose, right? And I think when George Soros established the foundation was exactly to address the kind of inequality that we are discussing here, and putting up front the need to face those challenges. I think, first of all, for us, it is very important, and we are a foundation that was based and funded much more on kind of civil rights and democracy and liberties than economic rights. But I think it is impossible today to address and to discuss democracy without putting the economic rights at the center of the debate, right? There is an issue, first of all, of legitimacy, right, of democracies that generate the kind of injustice with and inequalities, income and others, access to services, inequalities will never be legitimate, right? So the backslide in democracy that we see in the world has also a relationship with the level of inequalities that we are seeing. I think also it is very important. I think something new that is happening at the G20 and in forum, even forum like this, is that we were used to a world in which the multilateral agenda was kind of framed by the top and tried to kind of trickle down into the countries and social movements. And I think what we're seeing here is the opposite, right? The issue of inequality is the central part of the struggles of social movements around the world. And we are seeing that reaching the level of the debate at the G20, the UN, and other spaces. I think that's also the way to rebuild legitimacy for the multilateral debate, right? For the debate to speak to what people really care about and to the real needs of people, right? In a way that is different from the past. Also, I think when we think the world in which we are at, and I think all my colleagues here addressed it, the level of the challenges, and especially Frédéric, the level of challenges that we see societies facing, from climate change, pandemics, the inequality itself, those are challenges that will require a strong role of the state itself, right? Those are not challenges that can be met by goodwill of civil society in the business sector. It will require a strong role of the state, and for the state to be able to address that, it will need to have the fiscal capacity that can't come only from indebting countries more and more, right? And the way to do that is really to rethink the tax system and the fiscal ability and the idea of creating fiscal space, both in the global north, where I think are having strategies to do that, but especially in the global south, right? To allow countries to build green industrial policy, to allow countries to have policies that will address the real need of people. So again, if we are in the business of defending democracy, as we are right now, we need to put the discussion of taxing the super rich, of creating fiscal space, of rethinking the role of state, which is that state is at the end the final goal of the democratic dispute. We need to put that at the center of our discussion. So for us, that's why an organization like ours is putting so much energy in this debate.
So rethinking the role of the state, but I would almost put the same question again to you, Quentin. It's difficult, isn't it, for a state to take on billionaires and push through a policy like a wealth tax. And particularly at the moment where you have the US, which with a new government, with a second term for Trump, is going to be cutting taxes, is going to be deregulating, maybe pulling out of the Paris agreement on climate. So can this idea of a global tax on billionaires proceed without America's support, if needed?
Thank you for the easiest question on the panel. Let's not sugarcoat it. The political landscape for moving forward on the taxation of the super rich has become much more complex this week than it was a couple of weeks ago. There's no way around it. Does that mean that any progress on international deals for the taxation of the super rich is impossible? No. And again, it's very important to look at history and to understand how international tax negotiations function to understand why it is possible. First of all, we have a precedent with the first Trump presidency, where we had, in parallel with the Trump presidency, international tax negotiations on a minimum tax for corporations. It was discussed multilaterally under Trump presidency at the OECD and ended up with a deal that was basically ready when Biden came back to power, and then that the Biden administration endorsed. So we have a precedent, first of all. Second of all, it's worth noting that the US, even under a Biden administration, did not implement that minimum tax because they didn't have the majority to do so. But the negotiation, the deal, was designed to be implemented even absent of big countries like the United States. So it's also about us thinking and designing international tax deals that are where we can implement them even without some superpowers implementing them. So that's the second part. Now, in terms of really looking at the negotiation dynamics, because this is what we're looking at here. What happened over the past year is that we had a huge political momentum created, enthusiasm globally to tackle the question of the taxation of the super rich. What will happen? It's also important to understand the role of the G20, what it does and what it does not. The G20 is where political momentum is created, and William referred to that before. This is where you get a somewhat loose idea of what a global agenda is. But this is not where tax negotiations take place. The technical negotiations never take place at the G20. They need to take place in a much more inclusive framework. And this is what we're looking at now. Where will these negotiations end up? Will they end up in the UN? Will they end up in the OECD? Will they end up in both institutions? But they are likely not to end up and to stay, at the G20. Now, a word of caution, because I've seen tremendous progress and a lot of countries engaging, and also on the need to start with cooperation and transparency. And this is absolutely right. We need a global agenda for this. But we're faced with an emergency. Not only because there's much needed revenue at stake to tackle the climate crisis, to tackle the cost of living crisis. We're also dealing with an emergency in terms of tax consent, and you were referring to that. When those with the broadest ability to pay taxes pay less taxes than the rest of society, it erodes social consent and tax consent. And finally, it is, at the end of the day, about our vision for democracy. Is democracy one person, one vote, or is democracy $1, one vote? And this is the risk we're running here. The more we wait to tackle this, the more we leave power in the hand of very wealthy individuals that are able to meddle with political and democratic processes. And this is why we need to take action, and this is why we need to take action urgently.
$1, one vote. Yeah, that's a sentence that's going to ring in my mind for a while. William, could I ask you, you talked indeed about tax consent and the danger that this might break down as the tax burden increases necessarily at a time like this, amid inflation. But can we really, at this time, afford to be thinking about green taxes?
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que
So thank you very much. I believe three things. First of all, it's possible. We can see that on what exists today in the different countries, there is a tax on airplanes. It exists in France. It exists in 20 more countries, so there's a basis with this tax on plane fares so that we could move forward on this type of contribution. When we look at the tax on financial contributions, there's also about 30 countries which in one way or another have implemented this type of taxation. And we can see that in both cases, there's always room to be the first one to move forward, to show the way, but it's only meaningful and we only operate at scale and we only avoid distortions if there's a sufficient critical mass of countries committed, especially when it comes to the tax on financial transactions. We really need a top-to-down harmonization, and that's the same on the level of taxation. I would say it's possible, but we can see that climate stakes are here, they're very obvious. The US elections, we'll see how things will go. But I would say that we are confident in the sense that these are a medium to long-term agendas and we can do things in steps. So I think we really shouldn't stop. We need to continue. And I believe that the succession of G20 presidencies by Indonesia, India, Brazil, next year South Africa will change something. The other presidents were very efficient, but this has changed the perspective. And as it's been said, we need to take things differently. The G20 today, the agenda is really steered by emerging countries. The bet is to start from developing countries, small island African countries, for these agendas to then influence the G20, the OECD, the UN. So that's the first point, it's possible. The second point is that we have to show that international cooperation in terms of taxation functions. It's very important to fund the agreement on the two pillars for taxing companies, and we need to create a minimum tax. We've almost finished everything in an inclusive framework with 150 countries. We really need, there are a few final efforts to do. We also need to get to draw the right conclusions of this G20 OECD agenda. There's probably a call to make it even more inclusive for the agenda to be borne not only by the larger countries of the G20, but by the entirety of the international community. This is the call we're hearing from the G20, and we mustn't oppose the agenda of the G20 and the inclusive OECD and that of the UN. We need to move forward together. The final point, to move forward, we need a message from the heads of state, a strong message to G20. There'll be a G20 summit in a short amount of time. Next week, there's going to be a COP29 as well. We're all working for COP30, for the conference in Sevilla on the funding of development. Heads of the French, Kenyan and Barbados state have launched a call to action. And the idea is not for the countries today to say, I'm committed to implement a tax on financial transactions, a tax on air transport. We want countries to say, I'm interested in that. I think it's important and I support this agenda. So I think there's a lot of hope. And I think we need to be able to deliver for COP30 in Belém.
The COP30, yes, will be in Brazil next year. And Brazil has been very influential during its G20 presidency in putting the billionaire tax on the agenda. Do you think tax will be a big part of next year's COP? And how influential will Brazil be in moving things forward? Do you think we'll see the same dynamism that we saw earlier this year with the billionaire tax?
Definitely. I think, first of all, and to connect to the point I was making earlier, I think the idea that, and global citizens has been, I think, very important in this debate to showing that there is enough money and it's just about redirecting it, right? It's not totally accurate, right? I think there is, of course, there is enough money, but the idea that it's just agreement between, again, and goodwill from private sector that will get us in building the size of the investments that we need to tackle adaptation, to tackle the green transition. This is not accurate, right? We definitely need to think of changing the perspective for only debt as the way to get countries to achieve their climate goals, to really open and create the fiscal space through reforming the global taxation system and the national taxation system. So the connection between the discussion that we are having right now at the G20 that I think Brazil is putting forward, and the discussion about finance, which is not only about how to indebt countries more to deal with adaptation, and I think the Bridgetown perspective is also very important. For me, Ischien is very fortunate that Brazil got the leadership this year of G20 and next year from COP. I think it's also important to see that we have new voices emerging in the global debate about this, right? That we won't find solutions in the usual suspect places for the global challenges, and opening the space for countries like South Africa, like Brazil, like India, to be in the global arena proposing ideas, I think it's very useful. I think another example for us to look at was the UN Tax Convention that was opposed by the US, by Canada, and many other countries. There was an abstention of EU, but it was proposed by African countries and Latin American countries, and we got for the first time a UN agreement about a tax convention that was very solid, and it's also at the base of what we are discussing right now to do, and provided the political space, I think, to continue the discussion. So I think there is a lesson from not only the Brazilian leadership, but the new actors that are bringing new perspectives on how to tackle the global challenges that we have, that I think is a good lesson for debates that were many times restricted to the G7 or G8 space, that are now receiving much more complex and maybe more effective solutions. And as you said, right, if you think of the perspective of the U.S. elections this week, a world that we have not only the U.S. Thinking about what are the perspectives of the world, but these new alternatives that we're looking from Brazil and other global South countries, I think is a world that is the only possibility that we have to tackle the challenges that we have ahead.
Thank you. And yes, we tend to talk about tax consensus, don't we, at a population level, but I think there's also this idea emerging of tax consensus at a multinational level, at a multi-country level. And the UN was always about war and geopolitics, and now it's about tax as well, and it has set out it still very strongly on tax as a method of reducing global inequality. Before I come to you, Frédéric, I just wanted to, we've got a little bit of time, I just wanted to put a final slightly sort of technical question to Quentin, which I think might help explain to the audience how a global tax on billionaires works, because it's the one that people always ask me when I'm trying to explain the idea. It's like, what if one country says it's not going to do it? Then it can't be a global tax, and billionaires can just move their money there, can't they? I mean, it only works, doesn't it, if every country signs up, or am I wrong?
For a long time, we had the same conversation about multinational corporations. What happens if in that global conversation on the minimum tax on corporations, what happens if one country doesn't sign in? So the question is about designing incentives so that, first of all countries are incentivized to join, and second of all, you can protect your own tax base. So in plain English, translating that to plain English, that means two things. One, make sure that you have rules to prevent your own super rich to flee to one country where they would not be taxed. So how do you design an international deal where you have exit taxes, you have rules against anti-exile taxation rules, not to prevent mobility, but just to make sure that mobility is not incentivized by avoiding taxes. So that's the first level. The second level, which is much more ambitious, but in my mind is all the more necessary as well, is to make sure that if billionaires are not taxed in one country, if they have assets in another country, then those assets are taxable by other countries. And this is the philosophy of the minimum tax on corporations. If a country doesn't want to tax a corporation to the minimum level of 15%, then another one will do it. So there's no incentive for one country not to join. And this is why such agreements are doable even without big countries like the US or China implementing it right now. And this is what it is working at the moment. And this is what we need to consider for international agreements on billionaires. And as we put out in the global report that was commissioned by the G20, there's no technical barrier to do that. The only barrier left is a political barrier. We need more data to do it, and we're working on it, but the main obstacle right now is political.
Thank you. Before I go to Frédéric for closing remarks, if you have some questions you'd like to put, have a think while we hear from Frédéric, and then I'll come back to you. We were talking earlier about public opinion on these kind of taxes, and you said the Overton window has shifted. What did you mean by that?
Look, I think 2 years ago we wouldn't have had this conversation here. It's definitely clear we wouldn't have had it at the G20. We wouldn't have the IMF out there actually promoting very similar taxes and more progressivity and so on. These are just a few examples that I think today we do have probably a window of opportunity because of all the debate that happened over the last few years, where now actually taxes are, or international taxes are no longer a taboo. And also where we have actually the political leadership to move forward. So William said it, COP30 is really what we should aim for, 12 months. And I do think that a lot can move by then, especially because we have this unique opportunity with Brazil now finalizing, obviously, its G20 presidency, taking on the COP presidency. South Africa, first time that the G20 would have been Africa, and we know that at least some African nations have pushed this agenda of taxation, levies, the fight against climate change quite significantly. And also others stepping up. I think what we should mention, for instance, and it's in terms of the sequencing, it's very, very nice, I think, is that end of June, the world will meet in Sevilla in Spain for the Financing for Development Summit, which is a big UN summit, which only happens every 10 years. So it's a unique opportunity to make progress here already, and then obviously to fully deliver at COP30 in Bahrain. And this is also what people want. So if we talk, for instance, about the tax on the ultra-rich, across all G20 nations, there's huge support for it. Over 2/3 of people actually support such a tax, including in the US and even within Republican voters. And I think actually people might sometimes maybe ahead of their leaders. But as Pedro said, what's good about international politics, despite all the gloom we have at the moment, gloom, is that actually today it's no longer possible for very few governments actually to set the agenda. They need to take into account what citizens think and also other actors. So I really believe that there's lots to do over the next year. And ideally, if we look at what does success look like, is that at COP30, we hopefully have a number of coalitions of the willing that are going ahead and putting in place the different levy options that we discussed today.
Thank you. Audience, have we any questions? Yes, this lady in the front.
Very much. It was super interesting, and now I have a question from your experience, because I think you have all variety of experience, very interesting. What do you think? We know that taxes are necessary for development, for the climate, for health and everything. But how can we obtain the political adherence of governments to implement these kind of taxes in the current political spectrum?
Quentin, would you like to take that?
Very quickly, the idea that we would have a global agreement on a minimum tax of corporations 10 years ago, even 6 to 7 years ago, was totally utopian. The idea that we have a global deal on tackling bank secrecy 10 years ago was totally utopian. And yet, because of political momentum, we have those. Imperfectly, but we have those. The idea that 1 year ago we would have a conversation at the G20 with all, the 20 biggest economies in the world saying, yes, this is an issue and we need to work together on this, was also totally utopian. So you can see that the political momentum is shifting. Now, this is long, and building consensus on solutions might be even longer than realizing the problem, but we're moving forward, and this is where we need also citizens to be at the forefront of the conversation and bringing their leaders to account.
Well, we've run out of time, but it's rare that I finish a conversation about tax feeling positive about the future, but I do today. Thank you to my panel for such interesting contributions, and to you, our audience, for joining us.